So today, I was reading a book that I recently began to peruse through. It's called Death in Florence by Paul Strathern, and it is about the competition between, or really the struggle, I should say, the religious, spiritual struggle between the Medici family, a very powerful, wealthy banking family in Renaissance Florence, and a monk by the name of Savonarola. Savonarola was a man who began to preach against the paganism and the degeneracy of the elites and also of the ecclesiastical class in Florence. And he spoke out against Sodom with great tenacity. This guy was preaching intensely against the evils of Sodom and also of the sort of luxurious and decadent lifestyle of members of the clergy, including the Pope himself, and also the wealthy elites of his city. And the book tells us of the political and cultural and spiritual climate of the time. He gives us the context in which Savonarola grew up in which he lived. And the author does a good job in giving us these details. The book is so far accessible and enjoyable to read. But he talks about how in the Renaissance there was this spark in interest in Greco-Roman paganism. Much of this was presaged by Dante Alighieri, who lived in the late medieval period and who wrote the very famous book, The Divine Comedy, in which he talked about hell and heaven and purgatory, and he talked about Greco-Roman pagan gods. And in the beginning of his Divine Comedy, he asks, I think this is in the beginning of his Paradiso, he asks the god Apollo to enter his chest and breathe, thus giving him inspiration. It's very anti-Christian. It's not Christian, even though it has been marketed as so, even though Dante talked a good deal about the Christian religion, and he had the trappings of Christianity in his literature. Dante was really hugely responsible, if not the guy who really sparked this interest in paganism. Much of the interest in the Greco-Roman world also had to do with Greek scholars who would flee Constantinople after the Ottomans sacked the city in 1453. And these scholars would enter Italy and would begin popularizing Greco-Roman literature, Greco-Roman philosophy, especially Aristotelian philosophy. So it had a lot to do with Dante's interest in paganism and his famous work of literature, which spread like wildfire and still does. I mean, it's the most translated book in the world after the Bible. And it had to do with Greek philosophers who entered Italy as refugees, fleeing the Ottoman warpath. And so the elites began to they began to fantasize about pagan gods and goddesses, and they would have these festivals where people would dress up as Apollo and as Athena, as Zeus or whatever. And so this became to be a sort of vice of the elites. And in this air of spiritual decadence, many people, many regular folk, began to search for someone who could be as a prophet against this decadence, against this age of humanism. And this was Savonarola. And so many people turned to Savonarola. And it reminds me of something that I've talked about in the past, the interior revolution of the human spirit. When human beings indulge too much into the sins of the flesh, into the pleasures of the flesh, the human soul, the human spirit, revolts. It's tired of being caged within the fetters of the flesh, and so there is an interior revolution that begins. And I think that this doesn't just stop at an individual level, but I think that this also takes place in a collective level, and you'll have entire societies, or you'll have huge chunks of societies searching for spiritual nourishment and refreshment. That may explain the reason why Jordan Peterson has become so popular. And I'm not a huge fan of Peterson, but nonetheless, Peterson says things that are true, like getting your life in order and being more organized and being more spiritual and getting closer to God. And all of these things have really appealed to a lot of people. This teaching has appealed to a lot of people, and I think it's because after so many years of living in a sort of nihilistic lifestyle, or in a sort of ultra-materialistic lifestyle, people want someone who will guide them to more spiritual nourishment. Anyway, so the book also talks about something that I've also found quite fascinating, and that is alum mines. There is a mineral material, or a chemical compound, called alum. And this was an extremely important chemical compound in those days because it was used to fix dyes onto cloth. So you would use dyes to give color to clothes. The alum was used to fix the color on the cloth. It was also used for tasks such as cleaning wool. At the end of the day, this was a very, very important piece of material that was economically very powerful, or was a source of great wealth. Christendom, Europe at the time, or at one point in time, did not really have alum, and so Christian Europeans had to rely on the Ottomans for alum, because the Ottoman Empire had a great monopoly on the distribution and on the sale of alum, because the Ottomans were getting it from their own territories. But alum was eventually discovered in Italy, and there was a mine in Italy, or a group of mines, I should say, in Italy, in a place called Tolfa. The Vatican would eventually gain a monopoly over the Tolfa mines, and the Medici Bank convinced the Pope to basically allow the Medici banking family to have a monopoly over the alum mines. Lorenzo de' Medici was the one who did the negotiation with the Vatican and succeeded in convincing the Pope to hand over all of the holdings to the Medici Bank. The reason for this is, from what I have read, is that the Vatican had some pretty big loans from the Medici Bank, and so the Medici Bank essentially said, you owe us money, just give us a monopoly over the Tolfa mines. The Tolfa mines were obviously very profitable. They were a source of great wealth. Just to give you an idea as to how much money these mines would produce, every year the Vatican would make 150,000 florins from the sale of alum. Now you think 150,000, that's not a whole lot. Well, just to give you guys some perspective as to how much money this was, a very wealthy merchant at this time period would make about 200 florins a year, and that was considered wealthy. A mine worker, a man who was working in the alum mines, would make about 15 florins a year, and this would be enough to provide for himself and his family. So some poor mining worker would get 15 florins a year. A wealthy merchant would make 200 florins a year. the Vatican would make 150,000 florins a year from selling tulfa. Now, I'm not condemning the Vatican for making money. The Vatican at this time was a government. It was a country. In fact, it was its own state. It was one of the most powerful states in Italy. There was a handful of very powerful states in Italy. I think it was Florence, Naples, the Vatican, and Milan. And if I forgot one, you can just Google the powerful city-states of Italy during the Renaissance. You'll see them. But the Vatican was one of the handful of very powerful city-states in Italy at the time. And the Vatican also had to fund, it needed money to finance its wars against the Ottomans. So financing a war obviously takes a lot of money, which meant that the Vatican had to be involved in some pretty serious business dealings. The Medici family convinced the Vatican to hand over all the holdings for the Tulfa mines because, as I said, the Vatican owed a lot of money to the Medici Bank. And also the Medici family, or the Medici Bank, through Lorenzo de' Medici, or as he would be known later on, Lorenzo the Magnificent, told the Vatican that the Medici Bank could compensate for any sort of losses that the Vatican would get due to piracy. So in these days, there was a big problem with piracy. Pirates would hijack ships and steal products and steal wealth. And so any sort of, and the Vatican had to factor in for these losses every year. So any sort of losses that the Vatican would have due to piracy, the Medici Bank would compensate for by funding or by giving money to the Vatican. And so this was enough. And also the Medici Bank would manage the distribution of the alum. So all these reasons were enough to convince the Vatican to hand over all the holdings for these alum mines to the Medici Bank. So the Medici family was extremely wealthy. Politically, it was very influential. It basically ruled over Florence, regardless of the fact that Florence technically was ruled under a council called the Signoria. And the Signoria consisted of, I believe, 8 men who would be elected every 2 months. And it was an election by lots. So you would have a bunch of leather bags, and each bag was full of pieces of paper with names, and then the little pieces of paper would be drawn out, and the names that would be picked would be the ones that would be the names of those who would become members of this 8-man council. The ones who would pull the pieces of paper out of the bags were their own council. I think it was like the 100-man council. The 100-man council was completely controlled by the Medici family, and they would make sure that whoever's name was on, or all the names that were on these that were in these bags would be names of those that would be pro Medici. Bottom line. A lot of people resented the Medici family because of this, and there was even an attempt to overthrow the Medici family in Florence, but it failed because the leader of the Medici family at the time, Piero de' Medici, who was the father of Lorenzo the Magnificent, he knew about the conspiracy beforehand and he prepared for it, and he made sure to get an army from Milan to come to Florence. And the conspirators were so terrified of being killed, or one of the conspirators actually was so terrified of being killed by his own people that he just pledged allegiance to Piero de' Medici, and that was the end of it. There was a town called Volterra, and this town would discover its own alum. And this was a huge deal because Tulfa, the area of Tulfa, was a place where all the mines were. And now Volterra has discovered its own alum mines thus posing as a future competitor to the Medici-controlled mines in Tolfa. Well, it just so happened that Volterra was still under Florentine territory, and thus it was under the dictates of Lorenzo de' Medici. So there was a debate on who or what government entity is going to manage the toll or the this new set of alum mines in Volterra. Is it going to be the governor or is it going to be a council? And Lorenzo de' Medici said that the governor will rule over the alum mines because the governor was pro-Medici. This led to a huge anti-Florentine pogrom in the town of Volterra, and they began to murder Florentines in the town. This caused Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, to hire an army of mercenaries led by Federico da Montefeltro to enter Volterra and crush the revolt, the anti-Medici revolt. Federico da Montefeltro was a ruthless mercenary leader. Think Blackwater circa 15th century. And Montefeltro and his mercenaries attacked the town of Volterra. There was some pretty strong walls protecting the town, but in a matter of days, or maybe even weeks, I think, the mercenaries were able to penetrate the walls and enter the town. The townspeople surrendered, but that did not stop Montefeltro and his gang of thugs to sack the city, and there was a massive amount of murders and rapes and robberies that went on. And I just want to read to you guys an excerpt from this book. I'm literally just I'm doing this whole video in one take. I have no notes. Well, very little notes. I just wrote some of the names down so I can remember them because some of these names are difficult to remember, like Federico da Montefeltro, Piero de' Medici, and all this stuff. But yeah, I just want to read to you guys this one excerpt. So it says here on June 16th, 1472, after 25 days, Volterra surrendered. So 25 days of warfare, and the mercenaries were able to break through and force the town to surrender. After 25 days, Volterra surrendered, whereupon Montefeltro's mercenary troops went on the rampage, looting, raping, and murdering the defenseless citizens. As soon as Lorenzo heard what had happened, and this is interesting, Lorenzo de' Medici heard about the rapes and the murders that took place, so he went to Volterra personally and he gave alms to the people, basically to prevent any sort of revolution from happening again. But this did not remove the resentment towards Medici and the powerful family. There are some interesting things that I read in this book. Nothing has really changed. And I've said this so many times on this channel, but it's so true. Like, nothing has changed at all. You always have a powerful, wealthy class that rules the society, the political class, the very wealthy elites. They are in these superior positions, and then you will always have the regular folk expressing resentment or holding rage against the wealthy and ruling class. This has always been the case. And I understand that we elect politicians and all these things, but that doesn't change the fact that we have resentment towards politicians. Perfect example, January 6th, 2021, the riot at the Capitol building. What was the mob screaming? Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence. Well, they voted for Mike Pence. I mean, when they voted for Trump, they, by extension, voted for Mike Pence. But here they were calling for his execution. This is the ways of the mob. And so, in the case of Italy, Renaissance Italy, you had this very powerful Medici family. They had this extremely powerful bank. It was founded by Lorenzo's grandfather. His name was Giovanni de' Medici. and it was this long line of a very powerful banking family, and a lot of people hated them because they had the power to manipulate all of the elections. Like I said, Florence was ruled by a council called the Signoria, consisted of 8 men who would be elected every 2 months. Imagine having an election every 2 months. And the reason why they had it every 2 months was to prevent revolution. Because if somebody is in power for too long, then that gives space for resentment. And if people don't like a particular council within 2 months, they can switch it very quickly. That's the reason why they had that system. But you've always had a ruling class, and you always had resentment against it. And the resentment against the Medici family was due to the Medici family having such influence over these elections. Like I said, the elections were done by lots, by drawing lots from leather bags. Every single name put into those bags was a name of somebody that was pro-Medici. And the Medicis made sure that everybody's names in those bags were names of those who would be on the side of the Medici. And this is what caused the resentment. So you've always had a political class, and then you've always had resentment from the mob. Nothing has ever changed. And the Medicis had such sway over Florence for so long, but that did not prevent mobs, or that did not prevent this violent resentment against them. And that's always been the case. You have something like the European Union. It's been there for a very long time. It's been there for decades. It's been there, I think, what was it? Since the 90s, I think, we've had the Euro. And we had Brexit. Didn't take that long. And that resentment against the European Union is growing. You have these establishments that will be in power for a long time, but that does not mean they're not going to be taken down. Eventually, a mob will rise. Eventually, mobs will rise. Eventually, political opportunists rise up, and they capitalize on the anger, on the disgruntlements of the people, and they use that to go against the establishment. And then what always happens? Those people overthrow, they topple the established order, only to be ruled by another order that may be much worse and much more tyrannical than what was there before. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.